Richard, a week ago, you and the Thomas More Law Center that you lead released a public statement that had this headline: Exposed, Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel's tyrannical tactics to suppress religious belief in traditional marriage. And then it highlighted the Thomas More Law Center lawsuit. Now, in the release, you stated this, and I quoted it when I started the program. I'm going to quote it again because I think it sets it up well. You said this, quote, watching, listening, tracking, and compiling secret dossiers on dissidents until they are finally accused and prosecuted. These are the police state tactics one might associate with an authoritarian regime in a World War II movie. Going on, you said, yet these are the very methods being used by Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, acting in concert with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights and the Southern Poverty Law Center, end quote. So, Richard, watching, listening, tracking, and compiling secret dossiers on religious dissidents does, in fact, sound very tyrannical. So, exactly what did you catch the Michigan Attorney General actually doing, which prompted your lawsuit?
Well, thank you for that question, because it's very important. What we found out was there is this unholy alliance between the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and the Michigan Attorney General's office involved in basically thought control, attempting to chill the religious freedom and free speech of all Michigan citizens who believe that marriage is the union of one man and one woman. Now, what brought this to our attention was the fact that on February 19th, 2019, the Southern Poverty Law Center issued its annual hate crimes report and map that covered the United States in each state and included the state of Michigan. In the state of Michigan, they indicated there were 31 so-called hate groups. One of the hate groups that was mentioned was a religious group called the Church Militant, and they were listed as a hate group because they were anti-LGBT. And then what caught our attention 3 days later, this joint press release that was issued by the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, and by the Director of the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, where they said that they were going to keep a database on all bias and hate crimes, even if those did not arise, hate incidents, I should say, even though those did not arise to the level of a crime or civil infraction. In other words, they were just going to keep records, a database, a secret database of people who had spoken out against same-sex marriage or who had advocated for the traditional marriage solely between one man and one woman. So that really raised our eyebrows, since it was such a violation of the Constitution of the United States, where they would be keeping dossiers on people just because of their beliefs on a religious marriage versus the LGBT. So we issued a Freedom of Information Act request, trying to find out exactly what was behind that. And what we found out was that the Attorney General pushed back, was not giving us the information that we requested, and so we had to file a lawsuit. As I indicated, they said, and the Michigan authorities said, they were going to keep a database on hate and bias. One of the questions that we asked in our Freedom of Information Act was, what is your definition of hate and what is your definition of bias? They did not have any. In fact, there is no such crime in the state of Michigan as a hate crime. You know, there are crimes that maybe motivate actions that amount to a crime that may be motivated by hate, but there is no such thing as a crime of hate. And so we wanted to find out exactly, how they were going to implement this new strategy of keeping dossiers on Michigan citizens. One of the things that struck me immediately was that several years ago, Michigan citizens passed a constitutional amendment to the Michigan Constitution that stated that for all purposes, marriage shall be considered solely as the union of one man and one woman. That was passed by Michigan residents by 59% of the votes, which meant that 59% of Michigan voters could be theoretically placed in this database.
I just want to jump in here, Richard, because I think you've done very well in explaining that, but basically a twofold question. Number one, how is the Michigan AG Attorney General watching and listening and tracking all of this that's going on? And how does intimidation and thought control actually result from the types of actions she's taking?
Well, the first intimidation factor is that the Department of Civil Rights says we're going to have a database of anyone that involved in hate or bias, and if you're anti-LGBT, that's a hate crime. Secondly, we found out that the Michigan Attorney General started to conduct secret investigations on individuals or groups that they thought were hate groups. One of those groups was Church Militant. It was a religious organization that advocates marriage as solely a union of one man and one woman in accordance with biblical scripture. So Church Militant did not even know they were under investigation. The only reason they found out they were under investigation is after we filed our Freedom of Information Act request for the public records. The Attorney General said, we're not going to give them to you because Church Militant is under investigation. Church Militant didn't know that. So immediately we became very, very suspicious about those kinds of activities. We asked in our Freedom of Information Act request, we asked what kind of guidelines, what kind of definition were you using for hate? What kind of definition were you using for bias? What protections did you have in place to protect the constitutional rights of people who have done nothing other than voice a support for traditional marriage? What kind of constitutional rights did you have in place to allow people to know if their names are on this database so they could contest the factual basis for their name being on the database? It was as you indicated in the beginning in our press release, it was really a totalitarian type regime that was being foisted on the the Michigan citizens.
So, Richard, let me ask you a question right here. Let's go a little deeper on that. Did you find, or do we know, for instance, this investigation is just on the organization, or are they actually tracking it down, identified with people's names and quotes that they have made or statements? I mean, how specific are they tracking this information?
Well, we believe it's both the names and the organizations. But to your question, we don't know yet because they've refused to answer those questions. That's why we had to file a lawsuit in the Michigan Court of Claims indicating to the judge that they have refused to follow the laws of Michigan's Freedom of Information Act request. Therefore, we filed a lawsuit. We want to have an in-camera review of all the files that we've asked for to determine exactly what are in those files so that I could answer your question. But again, just the fact that they are holding these or have developed these databases for incidents of hate or bias should be of concern to every citizen in Michigan. I don't know of any other state that has ever done that before. Now, one of the things that really is of concern to me is that because they believe same-sex marriage or homosexuality is a human right, they're ready to crush every other freedom that citizens have to make sure that their view of this ideological definition of marriage